Okay.
Resolve the crises.
Check for victory.
No.
Advance the round marker.
Close. We were close.
Hey there, welcome to Board Game Barrister, our local game shop in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I'm Andy, and I'm here with Gordon and Ian, and today we are talking Daybreak. It's a game about global warming and climate change where we're playing as the world leaders trying to save the world. Let's get into it. Welcome to Daybreak, a game where we're going to play as the world powers trying to turn the tide on climate change before it's too late. The game's going to be played between this central world board and these individual player boards for each world power. Let's start by taking a look at one of those individual player boards. So here we've got Europe in a nutshell. We've got our energy demands up at the top here. We've got this little house that represents the demands of energy for our people and our culture. We've got our energy production, which is currently exactly meeting our demands. We've got some dirty energy as well as some clean energy accomplishing that. And then we've got all of our carbon emission sources from industry all the way down to food waste. Next up is our resiliences. We start with one of each type of resilience. That's between social, ecological, and infrastructure resilience. Those resiliences will help us withstand crises as they come up. And last is our communities currently in crisis. Everything's okay in Europe when the game begins, but as things start to get a little dicey and people get upset with us, we're going to start adding these communities in crisis tokens, which will eventually start reducing the number of cards we have access to. Every world power is going to start with 5 local project cards above their player board, and your local project cards are the main way you're going to interact with the game. And a local project has a few different parts. First, there are symbols up in the top corner that will be required for certain effects. We've got the name of the project, we've got reforestation here. Then you've got the actual effects of this card right here, and this one actually requires more ecology symbols for it to become useful. And then any limitations or requirements on how often it can be used. This one says once per round. To start each round, we're going to draw additional local project cards, and we can use those in a few different ways. One of those ways is to slide a card behind a project that's already in place, adding those symbols into that project stack. I've now got 2 ecology symbols in this project, which means I now have the ability to start reforesting and adding trees to the board. Separately, you can add a new project over the top of the one that was already there. This accomplishes a similar effect. You're adding more symbols into that project, but you're replacing the ability you have access to with the new card. Now, many of the effects on these projects have additional requirements such as discarding cards. That means you have to be able to discard cards from your hand in order to activate the effects of that project. So that's another way you'll be using your local project cards. And the last way you'll use cards is to tuck them under projects and crises to accomplish different effects, which we'll talk about in a second here. All right, back to the world board. Now it's very interesting. There aren't a ton of ways for one individual player to use their local projects to affect the world on a greater scale. But the one way you can have a greater effect with your local projects is to add additional carbon sinks. Carbon sinks are going to be all of the forests and oceans and eventually even some cool air filters that will help us soak up a bunch of our carbon emissions we're putting into the air before they have a harmful effect on the temperature. We start the game with a number of carbon sinks, as you can see here. We've got forests and oceans to begin. And on the rest of the board here, we've got a turn tracker for the 6 rounds we have to try to accomplish our goal. We've got some big negative effects of climate change that will slowly be getting worse throughout the course of the game, like the dieback of the Amazon or the loss of Arctic sea ice. We've got all of the recent emissions we've put out into the air, which we'll be tracking, and then we've got our big temperature tracker here, which kind of works like a doom tracker for the entire game. So the shape of each turn goes kind of like this. We're going to start by putting these crisis cards out that are going to be really negative effects we're going to resolve at the end of this round. But we put them out now because one of these starts as forecast, meaning we can see it coming and we can react to it if we're able. There are even projects we can take on that will allow us to forecast additional crises so we can see what else is coming. I'll put those along the side of the board and we'll come back to those at the end of the round. Next up, we're going to choose a global project to work on together. This is going to be one card we have in play that we can take advantage of as an entire group. They all have various good benefits, they'll have different requirements for us to work together to make them happen, and we're going to put the global project we choose along the other side of the board over here. And then we're into that local projects phase, where everyone's going to get new local projects like we talked about, adding them into their projects, carrying out their positive effects, good stuff like that. Except we now have projects and crises on the board, which we're allowed to tuck our project cards underneath to either mitigate the effects of a crisis or help out the effects of a project we're working on. Now the other project things you're going to be working on will either be adding clean energy to your board, maybe reducing your dirty energy. You might even find ways to reduce your emissions by getting rid of your emissions tokens off your board. And this is all very important because your dirty energy and your emissions are the main thing that drive the temperature up, and the higher the temperature gets, the worse things get for everybody. Because after everybody's carried out all of their projects, we're going to count all of the brown tokens left on everybody's boards, and that's how many emissions tokens you add to the board. If Europe didn't do anything in its first round to reduce its emissions, it's adding 17 additional emissions tokens into the environment. If we had 2 other players at the table, they'd be adding a bunch of emissions as well. And now what we do is we distribute our emissions into our carbon sinks. So we're hoping to have enough sinks to soak up all of the emissions, but I'll tell you right now that is not going to be the case at the beginning of the game. Alright, that's everything the environment was able to soak up on its own, which leaves me with 26 carbon tokens left to put into the temperature gauge. Now each of these squares on the temperature gauge represents 5 carbon emissions, and in order to increase the temperature we have to fill enough of those squares equal to the number of players. So my first 15 carbon tokens go into that first row, and they're going to add another 0.1 degrees to our worldly temperature. We don't quite add a whole other one here, thankfully, but as we keep adding to that temperature gauge, everything gets worse. Many of the crisis cards multiply depending on the number of temperature bars that have been added. There are little indicators next to each temperature bar that represent the number of crises we're going to have to draw every round, and that's going to keep increasing. And there's also a little die symbol here that means we're going to have to start rolling this die at the end of every round. The die is going to show one of the symbols for climate change effects, and each time we roll each of these symbols, we're going to move the associated token along its track. Whenever we hit these tipping point symbols, terrible things happen to us. Alright, and so as in so many cooperative games, this game has 3 ways we lose and only 1 way we can win it. We lose if our temperature gauge ever comes all the way up to 2 degrees and then would rise further. That's the end of the game. We lose at the end of round 6 if we haven't turned the tide on temperature change. And we lose if any player at the table would add a 13th community in crisis to their tracker. So how do we get out of this? Well, we win the game if, after we've distributed all of our carbon among our currently existing sinks out on the board, if we've got sinks remaining that have not already soaked up carbon, those sinks actually absorb carbon that's already in the atmosphere, and we begin the process of reducing the temperature of the world. This is called the drawdown. If we ever get to the point where we have begun the process of the drawdown by reducing what's in our temperature tracker, then all we have to do is survive until the end of this round. If we survive all of our crisis card effects as well as all of the climate change effects that we roll on the die, and we don't lose in any of those 3 ways we talked about, then we've managed to turn the tide on climate change, and we win as a team. Alright, so we just finished our game. We played with 3 players today. Gordon had done 1 kind of practice scenario solo to see how the game played, so we already had a lot of the rules in his brain as we were going into it today, and it took us 2 hours to play even after we learned the rules. So the first time you sit down to play this game, if you're going to sit down and learn the rules, you're looking at 2.5, probably more like 3 hours total sitting at the table from start to finish.
Yeah, when I played, so I had read the rules and then I played a solo player game, and my solo game took me about 3 hours. Now I had the luxury of just really going into the tank and doing a lot of thinking. But I think if you were learning it for the first time with a group, there's going to be a lot of crosstalk. So I feel like that 3 hours for your first game is going to be pretty accurate. And I guess with that, I played the solo player mode again last night, and I really felt it helped the group play a lot better. So, if you're willing to take on that burden and learn those rules and play a game for a couple of hours beforehand, you're going to have a great time with your group.
Okay.
We
Look at that.
A total of 5 in.
We got 1 round to.
We could turn this
go
around
back.
next turn if we survive the crises.
Yeah.
Jeez.
We didn't increase.
Yeah.
Wow.
The temp did not go up this year.
So this is a much longer game than we typically do on our Tuesday game tables, but it was fantastic. There'll be other videos out there that'll get into all the nitty-gritty. What I want to say is I love the feeling that this game produces, where you're starting off and it feels really overwhelming. Like, how are we ever gonna, save the planet? And then you get going, like, okay, you know what? I got a plan. This is working. And then you're like, oh, I needed to have started this plan a lot sooner.
The early part of the game was interesting because we had a lot of communication back and forth with helping each other out and making actions. And then right around, mid-game range, we were kind of just doing our own thing after that, once we've got our board figured out and how we were sustaining ourselves. But then there's the whole other half of the game where you don't know what crises are going to hit you or what's going to happen to you during the dice roll phase or what have you, that made it really how do we mitigate that feeling of, oh my God, we're getting overwhelmed.
Yeah, I really liked how in a cooperative game you often get this sense of like the bad stuff is going to scale and get worse as you get better. And this game has that in the form of the temperature slowly rising. All of the bad stuff gets even worse as that temperature rises. Most of them are multiples of how many tenths of a degree your temperature has gone up by. But it also has the added effect of, as Gordon mentioned briefly, the carbon footprint at the beginning of the game is terrible. Absolutely horrendous. You've got a decent number of oceans and trees to soak some of that up, and that's going to get worse and worse as the game goes on and you start to lose forests of fires and things like that. But watching on the first turn that your countries begin with such terrible industries, all sorts of food trash and transportation emissions, things like this, dirty energy. Most of you start with just a bunch of dirty energy on your board. All of that piles into this horrible carbon that gives you that sinking feeling of like, everything we have to start this game is working against us. We have to start mitigating those things, and you slowly start to see that carbon overload shrink.
Well, and the best part about that is the wind condition is not move the temperature down, right?
Yeah.
It's just do enough to start the process, which I think is really cool, and like what Gordon was saying, relevant to what the theme is for the game, right? Like even once we get perfect energy and aren't carbon emitting and we've mitigated it all, we just started to turn the world around and make it a better place. And of course the loss conditions are pretty much everything else. Like almost anything can just make you lose because your people are unhappy, or the trees are all gone, or there's no fish left, whatever it might be, which is again really cool nod to what the global crisis is now.
Yeah.
And there are, to track all of this, there are a lot of fiddly bits in this game. So this is, that is an appeal for some people and it's a detraction for others. But for a fiddly bit game, it is really elegant. The symbols all have meaning, it's really intuitive. There's a lot there to wrap your brain around to start with, but it locks into place in no time. Between the symbols and all the different tokens and the occasional die roll, it all makes a ton of sense, and you'll get that even though you have to move a lot of stuff around.
Yeah. And I should probably just call out, we all loved this game. We don't always say that, and a lot of times we're trying to find the good stuff and the things we did like, and it's a game we liked and we'd like to be able to talk to other people about it. But as soon as we finished, we were all ready to jump back in and try again and do better next time, because it's just got a really compelling difficulty and theme to it, and we were really enthralled with every element of it. So yeah, it's totally worth picking up. All right, that does it for Daybreak. Thanks so much for watching. We had a really good time with this one, as we said, and we hope you had fun watching. As always, hit that like button, leave a comment if you got a comment, subscribe if you want to hang out with us every week when we play a new game, and check out our online store. Daybreak is in there now, a bunch of other cool stuff as well. We'll see you next time. Thanks so much for watching this week. Daybreak, a game about global climate change and global warming. I was going to say all that good stuff. And I'm here with Ian and Gordon. I switched it up on you that time. Happy and sad.